Hey there, baseball fans. Nathan Rohde here for Prep Baseball Report with the latest episode of Coffee and Curveballs. Today I have with me a special guest, and that's Tosh Semlacher of Driveline Baseball, and we're going to talk about what they can do to help amateur baseball moving forward in the industry. So Tosh, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Nathan. Really excited to talk about this stuff with you.
Excellent. So real quick, before we dive into players, you guys were at the Super 60, got to see a lot of them on hand. Obviously, a lot of those guys passed the eye test, but there's a ton of data on them. We'll get to them in a second, but give me real quick the elevator pitch of Driveline Baseball and what you guys can offer to the amateur side of things.
So pretty much as like technology develops and all these different resources are put out there, there's a lot of information that athletes can see, and there's a lot of different things that they can find out from that information. But it's something that not everyone is able to invest the time into, nor necessarily has the know-how of how to do that. Mm-hmm. And so basically what we do at Driveline is try and take all these different puzzle pieces and try and understand each and every athlete to the highest level individually, and basically try and see what's the best way to develop that player themselves. So pretty much it's trying to become the best player development company possible through the use of technology and through, say, like original modalities, things like that.
Excellent. Well, let's then dive into some players. Isaiah Jackson was a guy that you mentioned to me that really stood out for his metrics, particularly the difference between his fastball and changeup. We can go into a lot more detail when we get you on a podcast, but talk about the spin direction and what stood out for him with that.
So when it came to his actual metrics, they were all pretty much, I don't want to say average, but when they are in comparison to each other, they relatively were. But one of the biggest things was the difference between his fastball and his changeup. Specifically, that change is what made the difference. And when it comes to his spin direction, one of the main things we focus on is just that one change on the, say, on like a clock, going from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And so with that, from going from your fastball to changeup, it creates a much, say, drastic or a greater drastic change in, say, the movement profile. Mm-hmm. And that mixed with, he had roughly a 600 RPM drop from his fastball to his changeup. And so those two things mixed together, in addition to the fact that his fastball, say, vertical break was 16 inches roughly, and his changeup dropped down 10 inches to about 6. Those three things blended together pretty much made that pitch extremely elite in comparison to his fastball.
Excellent. That's interesting stuff. So, and something to build on for him. But Trey Fromm, obviously, we know very well. He's a guy that's got a power arm, can really run his fastball into the mid-90s. And that's something that stood out for him as well. Fastball peak velo being 96, but again, spin rate for him is something that stands out not only with the fastball but the curveball as well.
Sure. And so when we were watching him, it was one of those things that I believe Shooter brought up when we were there, just about how the fastball played, and it was something that kind of just popped. And that's generally when you hear that, we've been able to mix that with analytics and understanding that that's generally an idea that the kid can spin the ball well. Mm-hmm. And so look back at the metrics, and roughly for his average fastball sitting around 90 miles per hour, he was sitting around 2,400 RPM, which is above average. And then for his curveball at around 73 miles an hour, it was about 2,600, which is above average. So between the two of those, that explains exactly what, say, anecdotally, you'd be sitting there going like, oh, the ball's jumping, it's got a lot of movement, it's very zippy. And you'd be sitting there like, oh, that makes sense because it's got a lot high spin rate. So that was one thing that made him stand apart.
Excellent.
And he had pivot picks too. So
Indeed. So let's give the hitters some love now. And Mackenzie Wainwright, again, passes the eye test, not only with the frame, but if you just watch BP, you know it's loud. But that's something that obviously jumps out in the metrics as well for him.
Sure. No, that was one thing. Again, it's one of those things that confirms anecdotal kind of eye test, things like that. The school method of scouting, where we look at, say, okay, sounds good, looks good. What's his actual, say, peak exit velo? So that was about 105. His average exit velo was about 95, which was one of the highest there. And then in comparison, when it comes to, say, the average launch angle on hard hit balls, which is generally it takes your 10% of what your max velo is, that was generally, it was about 20 degrees, which is exactly where you want to be. So we basically gauge it between 15 degrees and 25 degrees. And him sitting there right between that is exactly, that's kind of where, say, the amount of effect and damage that he can produce. That's pivotal zone. So it was a good, consistent place to stay at.
Excellent. And with the Super 60, we're looking at a lot of guys that are eligible for the draft coming up that June. It's been a little while since we've had underclassmen there, but we had one this year in Ty Hodge. And even though he's a 2021, it sounds like he stood out as well.
Absolutely. And, I mean, I would be lying if I didn't say that we took his age into account when I bring that up, and the fact that he's a younger guy
Sure.
and developing. So, like, one of the things we noticed was his peak exit velo was about 102. In general, like, his bat speed was elite for himself too. It was about 72 miles per hour on that. And then even again, like I mentioned with McKenzie, the launch angle on hard hit balls was at 22. Mm-hmm. So that's something that staying around in that zone, he's going to do damage as long as he produces that way. And of course, ran a good 60 time, looked athletic out there. His swing's just an athletic looking swing, very smooth. So, I mean, looks good to us.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate that dive into the players there from the Super 60. Look forward to going into more depth, on a podcast, but it's all very interesting. So we appreciate you joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Excellent. For Tosh Semlacher, I'm Nathan Rohde. This was Coffee and Curveballs, and until next time, we'll see you guys at the ballpark.